Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Maitri Between Friends podcast. I'm your temporary host, Ebony Collins, and today we will be discussing the South Asian perspective on marital rape, a crime in California, and how raising awareness on this topic is being discussed at Maitri. We have among us Maitri's Self-Sufficiency Coordinator, Tejeswi Dodda, and the newest member of Maitri's client advocacy team, Urja Patel. They will be discussing Maitri's recent findings of a listening session on marital rape and consent in intimate relationships. Thank you for listening. Let's get to the discussion.
Thank you, Ebony. Welcome, Urja. Today, I and Urja will discuss marital rape and consent in intimate partner relationships. As advocates working with survivors of domestic violence over the years, many of us have heard and been spoken to about marital rape and consent as part of abuse history. In many cases, it is the first time the survivor has ever shared it with anyone. Even when survivors acknowledge that sex was forced upon them by their spouse, there is a reluctance to term it as rape or to bring in consent into the context. Is it because of a belief system that emphasizes their role as a wife who has to cater to the needs of the husband, including those sexual? Perhaps. How can we, as advocates, address this cultural conditioning and belief system, yet be trauma-informed and culturally responsive to our survivors? How do we bring up this conversation with both survivors and our community? These were some of the questions that led Maitri to take a step forward in 2021, initiating a 2-year process of engagement with survivors, policy advocates, and community members in the form of listening sessions, discussion on our findings, and charting our next steps with the support of community members. Urja, I want to bring you in here. Marital rape has been a crime in all 50 states in the US since 1993. The current California Criminal Code makes no distinction between rape by a stranger and an intimate partner or spouse. How do you, in your experience working with survivors, feel or think that might be some of the reasons that marital rape is not largely reported or discussed?
I think in between survivors, one of the main reasons marital rape may not be discussed has a lot to do with, like, you stated before, the idea that, sexual consent in a relationship, especially a marriage relationship, is a lot different than consent in a non-marriage or non-intimate relationship. So I think in that case, a lot of times what happens is a lot of the survivors are confused as if they did consent or not. First, that's one of them. And second, maybe they've consented to engaging in a sexual activity prior. And so they think that because they've consented one time, that the consent carries on to the next time or the time after that. So I think that's one of the main reasons why survivors may be hesitant in discussing rape. It may not feel right to them. It may not feel that it was fully consented, but not knowing the proper definition and applying it to their experience makes it a lot difficult for them. I think also within our South Asian community, like you stated before, the role of the wife, it's to please the husband. And as much as I see that we're moving away from that ideology, I still see there's big segments that still kind of that are still present to this day. So one of them is, that idea that marriage and a relationship between a husband and wife is supposed to be private. It's supposed to be between the two. And when you do marry, that initial moment, that marriage ceremony, that marriage document that you sign, whatever it is, states that, well, now this person has consent to, engage in sexual activity with you, when in reality, that's not true until you give consent verbally, and, it's not coerced, it's not forced. And it's at that moment that you are about to engage in that activity. It's not consent until then.
Mm-hmm. I also feel that a lot of us use this interchangeably, like, for example, consenting to marriage, meaning consenting to sex all the time. And that is an interesting idea that stems from cultural conditioning, right? And so even though people might acknowledge, and even during our listening sessions and findings, large majority of respondents were moving away from the idea of punishment for marital rape. And what is your opinion on that?
I think, how California criminal code makes it, there should be no distinguishing between rape by a stranger and rape by an intimate partner or spouse. Rape is rape. At the end of the day, rape is rape. It doesn't matter if you've been intimately involved with this person prior or this is a complete stranger, it's rape. I think when we believe that, being raped by an intimate partner versus being raped by a stranger are inherently different, it's actually a very harmful ideology to have, especially on survivors, because when you are being sexually assaulted by your partner, that is domestic abuse. And the thing with domestic abuse and thing with relationships is we're in that relationship, how do I state this? We may be living in the house with them, right? So then there could be a constant fear that this is going to continuously occur. This is not going to be the last time. It's going to continuously occur. So you're in that state of fear in an environment that's supposed to be safe for you. Your house is supposed to be safe for you. Your relationship, a healthy relationship, is supposed to be safe where you can express your concerns. So I feel like when we don't acknowledge marital rape, we're kind of hiding a big part of domestic abuse that occurs.
Mm-hmm. I think some of what you said ties up into how people view consent and how they would view marital rape. And so as many seem to have different understandings of what constitutes marital rape in the first place. And then it is tied to their understanding and information about consent.
Right.
Much of my learning about sex and very little learning about consent came from books, sometimes films that didn't have any clear distinction between yes and no growing up in India. Is that a concept is that concept of consent evolving among young South Asians? If so, how?
I think our generation, we're a lot more informed on consent when it comes to knowing and understanding sort of more the dictionary definition. But if you were to describe scenarios and you were to ask me and define whether if consent was given in those situations, more than likely, most of us will be able to give you a confident answer whether consent was present or not. However, even with that understanding of consent, I think there are gray areas. I think when it comes to applying consent to our own experiences, we have a difficult time determining whether we consented or not in an experience. And at least, that's what I've experienced. That's what I can state from my personal experiences and experiences from my peers, there's always a conflict whether we can apply that definition of consent to ourselves. And a lot of that has to do with, being emotionally attached to the partner, or even just, you have this overall understanding of this person, that they're safe, they're not harmful. And then when you think about the overall definition of a rapist, it's, they're harmful, they're dangerous, this and that. So when we look at our partners, and these are partners that we turn to for safety, and now we're viewing them as a rapist, it's very conflicting, so that's another reason, people may not understand whether consent is present or not.
I remember that in one of the sessions, a panelist shared her view of consent as voluntary, enthusiastic, and ongoing. That is where I think we all hope it is headed, because it arises from so many different places. How do you think we can start this conversation? Of course, taking into consideration the close connection between sex consent in an intimate partner relationship.
I think acknowledging consent starts with sex education. And I know, through school we get sex education, but I think a lot of a lot of our parents, we're children of immigrants, and they may not have grown up with the same resources that we did, especially not the same education system. I can take my parents for an example. I don't believe anyone ever discussed consent with them when they were younger. So I think it starts by kind of putting that out there into their generation and, explaining what consent is, giving them information on consent, and then hoping that that practice gets carried on from generation to generation to generation. So it's not more so, teaching us, because yes, you do need to teach us, but it's also informing the older generations that didn't have access to such education systems, didn't have access to obtaining information, and maybe even just grew up in areas where such topics were taboo.
Mhm. Urja, I'm glad you brought up boundaries as well as discussing these at home. How can we create a space where these boundaries can be acknowledged, leading them to have conversations about behaviors like consent and sex or rape? Growing up in the US, did you think it was different for young South Asians like you to discuss these behaviors at home compared to young people your age belonging to different ethnicities or different cultures, not only with family members, but with other people that might be in your inner circle, people you trust?
I think one of the first things is to view consent in non-sexual manners as well.
Mhm.
So, I think one thing that's very prominent in our culture is we usually go hug people, go hug your uncle, go hug your aunt. Um, if the child is not okay doing that, then, I feel like that's a forced interaction, right? And so the child may not be that right there. The child is kind of confused, right there with what consent is, if the child does not feel comfortable, giving someone a hug, something like that. But I definitely think that consent, if we're going to teach our community, starts at teaching them in a non-consensual manner. Also teaching them that consent can be in different scenarios, and it's very we need to give realistic age appropriate examples to children. So for example, if we're starting to teach consent at the age of 5, teaching children what are appropriate parts of their body that an adult can touch, what are appropriate methods of communication, things like that, and then giving them a safe space to come to. I think that's another important thing, is children, and even when your children grow up, they become teenagers or they become adults, you need to give them that safe space that they can come to you. So I think, along with sex education, along with realistic situations and scenarios that are age appropriate, comes giving a safe space to your children. And even if your children are married, a lot of times we have that belief that once you're married, that's your life, whatever. You need to give your children that open space, that if you're not feeling comfortable, you can come and talk to me. You have that safe space.
Urja, I'm glad you brought up boundaries as well as discussing these at home. How can we create a space where these boundaries can be acknowledged, leading them to have conversations about behaviors like consent and sex or rape? Growing up in the US, did you think it was different for young South Asians like you to discuss these behaviors at home compared to young people your age belonging to different ethnicities or different cultures, not only with family members, but with other people that might be in your inner circle, people you trust?
I think the idea is sort of universal, whether you're a first gen South Asian, first gen Latinx. I think I noticed, a lot of my friends, they do have parents who are immigrants, and we really didn't have conversations with our parents regarding consent and sex education and things like that, even setting healthy boundaries. We didn't really have that conversation. So in terms of that, I think our role as first gen is to have and create that open space for possibly our children and possibly our younger siblings or anyone else that's, you know, younger in the community that may be going through the same thing. That's our role. But at the same time, it's also our role to give information to our parents and sort of open them up to this topic as well and inform them as well. You know, I think a lot of the reasons why these conversations weren't being brought up is because our parents lacked information regarding consent. And again, like I stated, you know, it's a taboo topic, but I think over time people have gotten more open to speaking about it. And I think as children get older, especially I've noticed in my family, as I get older, my family is a lot more open to discussing relationships and, you know, what they're happy about in their relationships, what they're not, and things like that. So I think it's important to create that space. And I think as first gen South Asians, and I think just in general as first gen, you know, children of immigrants, I think we need to create that space for the younger generation, as well as, you know, if we ever become parents, for our children as well. So that's how I think we can create a safe space. It
Yeah,
starts with us.
yeah, absolutely. And also, I think what was striking in terms of all the work we did in the listening sessions and engagement, that we had very little participation from men and boys. And so I think that is an important conversation we need to think a lot about, on how do we involve, how does this not sound like a women's issue, because it is not.
I think one of the ways we can do that is, you know, have a conversation in groups of, you know, like men go into a group and discuss it. I think that's really important. When there's a male sitting here and there's all females and they're discussing their sexual experiences or they're discussing consent, maybe the man can't relate as much. So there's sort of a hesitant to speak onto it. And so I think having a group where young boys get together and a male sort of what are they called? A peer, not a peer, a mentor, a male mentor is the one, you know, asking these questions, informing them to these young boys, you know. So I think kind of making it a topic, you know, showing them that it's not just a topic that you discuss with women, it's a topic that you discuss with men as well. And it's a topic that should be discussed.
Earlier in the conversation, I brought up films. Growing up, how Bollywood or Telugu films that I watched kind of might have created some understanding about boundaries and consent. Do you feel that media in general, including the movies we watch, the media campaigns we see, do you think these are things that could create a positive impact on creating this conversation, or do you already think it has started?
I definitely think they have the platform to start creating a positive impact, but I don't think it's being utilized as proper. I mean, I grew up watching Bollywood films too, and now I look back and I watch it after I've had all this education and this information, and after working with survivors. And I look back and I see how we really just kind of reinforce some of those cultural beliefs, you know, and always I feel like every movie it's the man, he's chasing the lady, you know, the actress or whatever. And it's sometimes like some of those movies, it looks kind of like it's harassment, you know. She's saying, no, I don't want to marry you, no, I don't like you, no this, and he's still constantly chasing her. So, you know, that kind of creates a very poor description of what a healthy relationship should look like. But I think the platform is there, you know, these Bollywood films, these Bollywood industry in general, they have that platform to create positive roles, you know, to show that what consent should look like, what an absolute no should look like, what a healthy relationship should look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, some of the suggestions we received when we did the listening sessions and in our discussion with community members was obviously to look at religious and faith leaders to create space for open relationship. Obviously, it's not very straightforward. These are not topics many religions might not address on an ongoing basis, but have you heard of any campaigns, or do you see creating that space with religious and faith leaders?
On the top of my head, I can't think of any campaigns. But I think when it comes to religion and discussing sex, it's a very there's a big gray area, because I think when you get religion involved, you don't want to be disrespectful towards a religion, but at the same time, the purpose is to bring information on consent. So I think one of the things that people worry about before discussing these topics and including, involving religious communities into it is the wording. So I think there's an area for us to kind of go and talk to certain religious communities and see if they're open to having these panels or holding group discussions. But I think we need to probably find ways to word it in a way that we're not showing that we're disrespectful towards that religion.
I agree with you. Also, religion and faith play a varied role based on personal belief systems. Some could view it as a deeply personal experience, might not welcome a legal or community intrusion based on their lived experiences as well as their cultural conditioning. Marital rape and consent in intimate partner relationships is a very sensitive topic with many perspectives and interpretations, as we've seen today and in much of our work during these 2 years. As an agency for us, this engagement has allowed us to understand the barriers to create healthy relationships, along with reminding us the stigma and the taboo that comes with these topics in the community. It has given us a lot of food for thought in terms of our next steps. We will take into consideration some of the recommendations, such as creating shared spaces, open communication channels that will funnel difficult conversations to build prevention strategies in addressing domestic violence, including rape. There is also a need to bridge the gap between immigrant experiences and realities in the Bay Area. We will certainly take the community perspectives and share it with thought leaders and policymakers to bring them on board with our conversation. We certainly hope this is only a beginning, and we are looking forward to continuing this work with all stakeholders involved. Thank you, Urja, for joining today and for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the insightful discussion. This has been the Maitri Bay Area Between Friends podcast. You can find us on all platforms, and you can find us on all social medias at Maitri Bay Area. Thank you.
This show is for informational purposes only and is not to be construed as legal advice. Always consult an attorney for legal advice. Views expressed by guests of the radio show are individual opinions and not endorsed by Maitri.
This project was made possible by funding provided by Santa Clara County Office of Gender-Based Violence Prevention.